Hey everyone, thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to jump on and join. Uh, like Elaine said, my name is Will Norton. I'm a Senior Director of Product Marketing here at CloudBolt. And a bit about my background. So prior to working at CloudBolt, I actually was a capability leader at a kind of a large global systems integrator. And one of the great things that I was able to do in a past life is bring an inaugural FinOps solution to market for our organization, and ultimately help organizations of all shapes and sizes on their journey to kind of going from starting off FinOps all the way through to advancing and maturing in their FinOps practice. A lot of that was focused on things like showback and chargeback, which we're going to be talking about today. So very excited to be joined by Callum, who I'll hand over to give a bit of an introduction. Also comes with a wealth of knowledge and background in the FinOps space.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. And thanks very much, Will. I'm a senior solutions architect here at CloudBolt, and I work with our customers, helping them implement FinOps and use CloudBolt to implement FinOps across their organizations, whether that's an enterprise or cloud service providers. A little bit about my background. I have a background in technology consulting, where I was on loan to the UK public sector, working at the Health Security Agency, so implementing FinOps on a large enterprise scale. So again, chargeback was one of the big issues that we faced at the Health Security Agency. And it's a theme that constantly crops up across all of our customers. So very excited to be talking through some of the problem sets and solutions today.
Awesome. Thanks, Callum. Well, a couple of things about CloudBolt prior to jumping on to kind of the main topic of the day. So CloudBolt is a FinOps Foundation partner. We work very close with the foundation. And if you've been to any of kind of the roadshow events or some of the premier events like FinOps X, you may have run into us. You'll find us in the partner community, and we're kind of actively a part of this. A lot of our organization is specialized and certified in some of the FinOps certifications that are available. So if you do happen to end up at any of these events, please look for us. We'd love to have a conversation in person, and we are definitely going to be at FinOps X both in North America next year as well as in EMEA. And then just before we kick off the event, I wanted to kind of extend something to keep in your mind. Obviously, having a webinar and going through some best practices in this forum is always great, and hopefully you take a ton away from that. But we're also offering up the opportunity to kind of work with our FinOps experts on more of a one-on-one style session after this. So we're going to send details about that via email, but a lot of times there's plenty of questions that will come up, and every organization and business is in kind of a different place in their journey for just FinOps in general, as well as building up that to that kind of maturity of having a formalized chargeback program. So happy to have a breakaway conversation where we can kind of tailor some guidance, build actionable strategies with your team, and really answer any sort of questions that you have as you go to kind of implement chargeback in your business. This is a no sales conversation, so just really offering this up to be a little bit more intimate and walk through some of the things that you may be dealing with and facing in your organization. So we'll send out details and we'll make that available to anybody who joined. All right, so on to the main content, and what we're going to be talking about today is mastering AWS Chargeback implementation. So a lot of the conversation we're going to have today is really going to be tailored towards AWS, but I think what you'll find is that a lot of these principles and best practices and steps are going to work across other clouds, as well as even onto kind of multi-cloud environments. But first, I think it's important that we start with just what is the definition of chargeback, because there can be confusion about just generic reporting, showback, and then chargeback, and there is differentiation between all three. To me, chargeback is really a method of holding business units directly accountable for their cloud spend. And so it's the process of allocating consumption and spend of cloud services from finance systems back to user teams. And really what that means is that as parts of the organization are spending in the public cloud, it is coming out of their, a lot of times budget or P&L, and they're directly held accountable for their piece of the pie from an organization perspective. The difference between that and something like a showback is showback doesn't go all the way through to billing or invoicing different parts of the organization. It just shows them what they're spending with kind of predefined logic that we'll talk about today. And then just reporting is essentially just making self-service reporting available for cloud consumption. And you'll start to see the differences in these three things as we go through. But wanted to kick off with that, so we're all speaking the same language. And here's the thing. I mean, Callum talked about this earlier. I definitely saw this with a lot of even Fortune 500, 50, and 10 organizations when I was working with them. The current state of chargeback is not in a great or mature place. A lot of organizations are looking to implement a full-scale chargeback program, but what we find, and if you've read any of the FinOps reporting that happens annually by the FinOps Foundation, what you'll see is that 30% of organizations are reporting that they do not charge back today. And the ones that do, 33% of them are using Excel spreadsheets, so very manual, probably not all that accurate, certainly has a high potential for error and inconsistency. There are plenty of organizations that are using some tooling, whether they're using like a Power BI or some sort of third-party tool, but they report that it's highly manual. There's a lot of involvement needed, and it's truly not automated. And then finally, for those who are automating, 11% are automating without finance. So the finance team is not involved, and there's not really that movement of money across the business. And so in a perfect world, I think most organizations are looking to have a chargeback program, have it be automated, and have it be integrated with IT finance and the finance of the organization. And so with our customers and a lot of the partners that we work with, it is something, it's kind of a key use case for our platform. And I would say that this is definitely a challenge that a lot of organizations are facing. So let's zoom out and let's talk about what are kind of the 5 phases in order to kind of lead into what would be a formalized chargeback program. And we do recommend these phases in order, because you have to kind of have the precursor steps to make it successful all the way through the end. So we'll go through these and we'll talk about the best practices for each. But first, it's audit your setup, understand your architecture. We'll work through that. Then you talk about billing logic and defining that and implementing it in your business. Thinking through things like savings and markups, very important topics to ensure that as you go to charge back, your custom logic for this is defined. Then there's this phase of ensuring that you show the logic that you have defined and create budgets for your organization for some set of time. And we'll talk through that before you go straight to chargeback. That way you don't surprise or shock your organization. And then the final things are really just more kind of administrative and tying up the loose ends around how do you integrate with finance and how do you ensure you're communicating and you've got the right standard operating procedures in place. So it's these 5 areas we're going to talk about, and then a couple other considerations at the end. So let's start with kind of the most baseline fundamental thing you need to, especially in the early stages of talking about chargeback in your organization. These are things you need to settle up at least as close as possible to getting it perfected before you kind of go on the rest of the journey. And it really starts with understanding your architecture. And this seems almost kind of simple and a no-brainer, but what we find a lot of times is that when you start to ask questions about your AWS financial framework with FinOps leaders, IT leaders, and finance leaders, a lot of times that's not well documented. So understanding what organizations you have from a billing perspective for AWS, what are the payer accounts that you have, and then things like what are your purchasing program details. So if you're working with maybe a service provider and you're procuring the cloud through a reseller, what is the setup there? And if you're going direct with AWS, what does your purchasing program look like? And that's going to be things like discounts, additional line items such as support. Maybe you've got reservation alignment with AWS, and you've got special purchasing considerations there. And all of that needs to be well documented and available, because it's going to guide some of the subsequent things that you need to work through. So really understanding your architecture, understanding the cloud as it stands and how you're being billed and the logic that's being used to bill at the highest level is very important. Then from there, it's really understanding your cost centers and ensuring that you have a master list of cost centers available, and that all the owners of these cost centers are identified. Now, I know every organization is different. Some use business units, some use cost centers, some use projects that have a set time. Knowing that and ensuring that you've got a database full of cost centers and it's kept up to date and it's operational is very important. I think a big thing on this one is, where does this live? We've seen it in Excel documents, probably not the best practice, but those mature organizations usually have this sit in a CMDB, like a ServiceNow, or something of that effect, or even maybe a financial system that's used. But ensuring that that's well documented, up to date, and there's standard operating procedures around that is very important, as well as there's nothing left out. So there's no parts of the organization that don't necessarily have a cost center available. And then on to the common challenge, which is your tags, and making sure your tagging structure that's in place has well-defined financial components. So there's a lot of best practices here, and I think ultimately you're probably going to be building your billing logic and your reporting logic off of these tags. So ensuring that you've got them in place, things like your cost center, who owns that cost center, and other things are very important. Callum, I don't know if you have any thoughts on what the best tags are, common tags that you've seen in place.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a really useful one is project or workload, so that you can identify the specific workloads within departments or within teams that are using resources. And that allows you to get really granular with cost codes.
Exactly. And, I think there's, having a list of, or a charter around what's required and what's optional is also important. So you may have those 4 or 5 tags that are absolutely mandatory for chargeback to work. Then you may have some optional ones that are nice to have and not need to have. And then probably the most difficult part for a lot of organizations, if you've not resolved this, is fixing your tagging. Most organizations will set that goal for 90 to 95% accuracy or allocation from a tagging perspective. The second that you don't have a tag is, the consequence there is that you end up not billing parts of your cloud environment back to any charge, and then that sits with centralized IT, and then they have to kind of take that bill in. So fixing your tagging, while easier said than done, there's plenty of tools. CloudBolt's got a lot of capabilities that can help with that and get you to a very high compliance. You certainly don't want to be moving past this if you don't have a pretty good state for your tagging. So that's audit your current setup. There's some other things that you may think about outside of these, things like defining your spending categories across IT, understanding your categories of spend, the resources you're using. And again, just kind of really understanding the state of your cloud can also be very important, but it's these 4 that you'd want to make sure you have nailed down before moving on. And then it really is, what is your billing logic? How do you want to institute a chargeback program? Now, some companies, their finance teams already have some parameters around this, but you're going to want to make sure you have these things nailed down. The first is a simple one. How often are you going to bill? Are you going to be doing this monthly, quarterly, annually? How does that work? And when do you actually go through the process of charging back? If you do it consistently, it may not align with other billing schedules within the business. So if you're doing something monthly, that's when you're getting your cloud bill. So that might make sense for some IT teams, but it may not match other billing calendars that your finance team might have. If you go too long, you run the risk of having this consolidation that is a heavy lift, and There's can be kind of a backlog of questions and answers from the business leaders to go, why did it cost this much? And you might inundate your FinOps and finance teams with kind of a burden of a ton of questions. So finding a balance between, monthly, quarterly, annually, or whatever schedule, I think is something you should pay close attention to. And then there's all of these kind of outlier services or categories of billing that you have to make sure you account for. It is very easy if you've got a certain resource or a certain grouping of resources that has a defined user or user group within the business, and you can kind of quickly allocate that. But there are plenty of costs that don't have the kind of one-to-one association. So there are plenty of unassociated expenses. I think the ones that we commonly see that can be tricky and you want to think through is things like AWS support. If you're paying for Premier support, typically you have to pay for support per payer account. So are you paying for that from AWS? Or even things like, are you paying a service provider for some level of support? And where does that factor in? And then things like marketplace charges. If you're buying bulk licensing, or if you're buying third-party software or anything else you can get on the AWS market, that's going to show up in your bill. How do you distribute that to the business is something you definitely want to nail down. Shared resources, that can be very difficult. There's a bunch of best practices out there. We'd be happy to go deeper on some of those best practices on a spin-off call. But how are you going to allocate shared infrastructure, such as containers, very popular, shared storage accounts, and even networking can be another one of those cost lines. There are plenty of organizations that decide, hey, we're gonna take the cost of these shared resources at the centralized IT level, and it's going to be a part of our budget, especially if it's more infrastructure for the cloud and for the rest of the business. And then other organizations try to find a consumption path, who's using what level for each of these resources, and some even split it out evenly. But plenty of options there. You definitely want to have that defined and well documented. And then do you, as a centralized IT team or a centralized FinOps team, do you want to add any custom service lines to your bill, right? I know there are plenty of IT teams that build, architect, build, and deploy resources on behalf of their broader organization. And if that's something you need to bill back, you can absolutely add that into your billing logic. So if there's any kind of custom service lines that you have, you can definitely integrate that into your billing logic. But having all of this defined and ensuring that it's documented is very important. And there's other considerations around things like cost life cycles. So how long are costs going to be paid by central IT? When does a business unit begin receiving invoices for a set of resources? And even questions like who will pay for proof of concept, dev, and prod environments. There are plenty of ways of doing that. Some organizations will say central IT, will do any sort of POC and will pay for that. Some say that every resource that's deployed is paid by the business center. And then there's plenty of organizations that say, well, we're going to make the business pay for a set of infrastructure for a few years, but once there's a return on investment, central IT will take that cost. So there's these other considerations around life cycle of cost that you should also think about. And again, get that nailed down and documented. Then there's some of these more tricky components that are more aligned to how AWS is billing you, as well as how you're working with maybe service providers or resellers. If you get a volume discount provided to you either through AWS or through a provider, you need to kind of evaluate, are we going to share all, some, or none of this discount with the organization? Meaning, when you save that money, who's saving it? Is it everyone? Is it distributed based on consumption or total billed amount? Or does it just basically become a savings for centralized IT and the FinOps team itself? So you're holding that at the top level. It's the same thing with reservations. If you are purchasing broad strokes of reservations across your organization and your accounts, how are you distributing that? Again, is it equal? Is it withheld? Is it based on consumption, or where the reservations actually are applied? A lot of that logic is available in AWS, but you have to decide and you have to be firm on that, because if you don't, then there's going to be confusion. Same thing with savings plans, similar thing to reservations. And then there's other additional logic that you may be thinking about from a markup or discount perspective. There are plenty of organizations that mark up the overall cost of spend by a few percentage points so that they can offset the IT team's expenditure, right? So being more of a profit center in the business or a service center in the business, you can do that. You can also even go down to granular levels of, hey, we're just going to mark up kind of core infrastructure that we support, like networking, like analytics, like some of the backbone components. You can mark that up so that you are essentially charging the business for your support and management and operations of those things. There's also other things like AWS credits that some companies will get, depending on what type of organization and setup you have, and that's another cost line that you have to determine. Are you going to distribute that to the business? Again, a lot of ways of thinking about that and deciding. One of the ones that we see a lot is if a reservation is purchased at a data resource level or at a business unit level by a business owner, then they get to keep that savings. But any broad purchase of a reservation or a savings plan done by the FinOps team or the IT team across the estate, that's going to be withheld at the top level. So there's logic like that can make sense, and it also can incentivize your cost owners to make better choices on the ground floor.
I think there's also I think there's also like a maturity discussion to be had here as well, because you don't need to do all of this right at the very beginning. Yeah. So if you're just starting out on your FinOps journey, it probably makes sense for your FinOps team start doing the volume discounts and the reservations and stuff. And then as you get more mature through your organization, then you can devolve that to business units and projects and so forth. So it's really important to kind of just start taking the first initial steps, and you don't need to kind of have all of this planned out straight away. You can kind of devolve this as you go along your FinOps journey. You've got to kind of crawl before you can walk.
Right. That's right. It is a fair point, and absolutely, sometimes it's best to just kind of start with your chargeback program. Don't necessarily need to have all the logic defined, and then as you learn and as you meet with your stakeholders, then you can start to institute these things with a heavy dose of communicating to your organization prior to making any changes, right?
I think a big problem is that a lot of people find is that they're a bit overwhelmed. It's like there's a lot of things that you can kind of take account of in FinOps and in chargeback. So just starting small, and even if you then kind of slowly get bigger and bigger, you're still going to be making progress. Just kind of one day at a time.
Yeah, and even, a great point there, Callum, is even just saying, hey, we don't have a defined way of doing this yet, is still having a stake in the ground, right? And so if there's a question around, from your stakeholders, hey, how are you guys handling reservations? Hey, we're still working through that. Like right now, it's essentially getting mapped to where it's applied, but we're working diligently on that. You're right. You don't have to run. You can crawl and walk, but understanding these components, I think, is at least a first step, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Great point. So the next thing is really around implementing showback and budgeting. And this is a precursor, and I know Callum will talk a little bit about this and how you can support this with our platform, but it is very important that once you've kind of defined your logic and you understand the components of your billing logic, you have to ensure that you are providing a little bit of lead time for the users to kind of understand, what is our budget for this? And can I see the reporting logic that you are going to use prior to you billing me, right? So let me see it before you bill it so that I'm not shocked and I can ask questions. So there's kind of 4 pieces here. The first is you have to ensure that the cloud is a part of your budget strategy, right? And so a lot of times that can be a big hurdle, but what is the budget and what are the timelines for budget and how is that communicated and held? Typically, there is some sort of budget that's extended to cost centers by a financial body, but incorporating cloud into that can be very tricky because of the nature of the cost being variable. So, working with finance to define that, and there's a bunch of different ways of doing that. You can just start by going, hey, what'd you spend last quarter, last year? whatever, and baselining against historical use. Or you can, go even further and make it, per project, per deployment, per, essentially just a stake in the ground across the business, according to finance. There's a bunch of different ways of thinking about this, but you have to think about a budget, because obviously if you're billing, it's going to go against that budget. So having that nailed down and ensuring that that's communicated is important. And then just like with the cost architecture, you want to make sure you've got this documented somewhere and held onto. So a lot of times the master record kind of sits in a CMDB, or it sits in a financial system, but you have to make sure that lives somewhere and it's being maintained. A lot of times that's just working with finance to ensure that whatever they're doing, you're kind of extending to the cloud. The next level is ensuring that your users that you're going to be billing, that they have access to see their cost easily. And this can be a challenge if there's not, similar to your own credit card statements and your own banking, you want to be able to go in every single day and look and see where you're at and how things are moving and be able to react and take accountability of your spend. But not having, the self-service access to that is a barrier to being able to kind of understand your cost. So providing that is very important. It can be cumbersome if you're doing things like Excel or Power BI. It can be very easy if you've got like a third-party tool. You can manage that at scale. And then these two are kind of connected, which is this showback cycle. So there's a difference between self-service access to reporting and really having a showback cycle. Showback cycle is basically going, okay, here's the reporting, here's all the logic that we defined in these other slides layered on top of that. And essentially saying, hey, Callum, here's what your bill would have been had we charged you. And here's what constitutes your internal invoice, right? And allowing Callum, I'm sure a lot of organizational users will get to this point, the first few cycles, to go, hey, I've got a question about this, or why was it this much, or what's this line item? Just being able to kind of nitpick that invoice. What you'll find is the first few cycles where you run a showback, you're going to get a lot of questions. You're going to learn a lot. You're going to have to kind of tweak your methodology. But the nice part is you're not actually billing anybody anything yet. So giving yourself at least one, I actually recommend 3 to 6 billing cycles where you're just showing back and you're kind of gathering feedback and you're getting those questions. And it's very important that once you kind of go through this, what I'll call proof of concept with showback, that you keep that logic and you don't change it when you go to chargeback. I've seen this, burn a lot of organizations. You do the whole showback thing, you do the whole self-service reporting, and then when users log in to go look at their reporting on a Tuesday, and then they get their bill on a Friday, they just don't match. So it's important that the reporting that you have matches the logic, the showback that you have matches the logic, and that nothing changes. And Callum was going to talk a little bit about how you can use advanced platforms like CloudBolt to build that logic into your self-service reporting in your showback.
I think that's a really important kind of value of like the third-party tools as well, is that they allow you to do this outside of the hyperscalers, outside of the cloud providers. When you do something in the hyperscalers, a lot of the time it's permanent and there's a bit more risk associated with that. Taking all of this outside of your cloud environments and being able to kind of chop and change it so it's not permanent. That's a real value of using a third-party tool, I think.
Absolutely. Or else all this seems just like every line, every recommendation seems like a burden, but a lot of tools, and I know ours, you can just kind of go in and really just define it very easily. So the final thing is, once you kind of work through these considerations and gone through some of this early stage stuff, it's how do we integrate this with finance and launch, right? And this is more operational. It's just making sure your organization is ready for this. Certainly you want to have a standard operating procedure, a logic, an architecture. All of this stuff needs to be well defined and documented, because if you don't, then you're going to get a lot of emails, a lot of Slack messages, a lot of calls on your calendar with questions from business leaders asking. So it's better to have this defined and aligned, as well as who owns what. What level of ownership do the actual billing owners have versus the FinOps team versus the finance team. who owns what part of this process is very important. Integrating with financial systems is the nirvana, right? So it's, how is your IT finance or your finance team, how are they handling the master ledger of your organization today? And how do you take whatever you're doing with FinOps, if you're using a tool like CloudBolt, how are you taking CloudBolt's data that report all of the analysis and actuals that happen, and essentially integrating that in with your finance system so that they get exactly the data they need every single time they're billing, and they can burn down that budget and do all that back-end work. Understanding where you've got your master ledger, again, as you charge the company, how does that update the CMBD record? And again, there's automation and integration that tools like CloudBolt can just do that essentially automatically, or they're more of a manual process, which you probably want to avoid. And then I went to school for business communication, so I always got to have, you have to communicate. That's not just an email. That's usually, have a few webinars or internal kind of conversations where you allow your users to come in and ask questions, and you walk them through this process, and you show them the tooling, and you enable them on what's to come as much as possible, so that when you turn this on to launch, your FinOps teams are not bogged down by a whole host of questions, right? So I think it's with these four that if you can get this right, your launch will go very, very smoothly. Any thoughts on this, Callum?
I think communication is really key. It's what it all boils down to. Yeah, it's about kind of communicating between your finance and your operations teams, and communicating with your engineering teams, and having kind of common data. So your finance guys need to understand the cloud resources that are being used, and your engineering teams need to understand how much those cloud resources cost. And so that's really the crux of Chargeback, is getting your finance teams to understand the services and your engineering teams to understand the cost. And if you can speak that language and get both teams to speak that language, then you've solved the problem, no matter what kind of process you put in place. That's the kind of key.
Exactly right. Exactly right. All right. Now the final thing, and this is just more pro tips. There's some guiding principles here that I would just throw out as final considerations for anybody who's thinking about moving to a formalized chargeback program. First, it's set clear goals. What are you looking to achieve? Does your organization work as a profit cost center? Does it have that model? Is the central IT team looking to actually burn down budgets of P&Ls? If that's what you're looking to do, then chargeback is the logical approach. Or maybe as a FinOps team, you're just looking to get the right behaviors in place, and you have to have the accountability to ensure that you're steering the behaviors. And maybe it's both, but just understanding why you're doing this, because it can be a tricky process.
And these goals need to change over time as well. So as you mature in your FinOps journey, you'll set more ambitious goals. So don't feel like you've got to get to 100% allocation within the first 6 months. That can be really, really difficult for some organizations, particularly when you've got really large estates. So the first goal might just be to start the conversation and give your production teams visibility of the cost that they're spinning up. And then in the next 6 months, you might target your development environments, depending on the resources that you guys have available. Set manageable goals, set achievable goals. You don't need to do it all at once.
Exactly right. Return on investment, just considering, hey, listen, this is a bit of an undertaking. It is an operational process you're introducing to the business, and it does have implications on your team. So, making sure that, the goals and the outcomes all align with the kind of the value being pulled back from this. And we see plenty of organizations that just go to chargeback, just go to showback, and don't make it all the way to chargeback, because they want the accountability, and they want to be able to go, hey, listen, this is how much you're spending and all of that, but they don't necessarily need to get all the way through to chargeback. Or you can scaffold. You can go from, hey, we're not really going to go full steam ahead with chargeback. We're just going to introduce chargeback for just production systems or just certain business units that we've agreed with. You don't have to roll this out across the organization. You can step into it. But the ROI is very important. It's fundamental that you have to be balanced, fair, and consistent with this. If you make changes to your model, which you ultimately will have to do that, you have to make sure you're communicating it, and you can't use different logic on different teams. You're going to get a lot of blowback, right? So if one business unit gets some sort of discount, the other one needs to have one as well, and these all need to be clearly communicated. If you're billing one entity, you probably should be billing all entities, or you need to have that worked out internally. We've seen, discrepancies in fairness and consistency, and that can cause some heartburn. Being transparent, I think we've hit that nail on the head. You definitely need to make sure you're communicating and all of your logic is readily available. And the final thing is just making sure you're organizationally aligned. Is this a goal that IT finance or finance backs? Is this what your senior leaders are looking to do? What are the other parts of the organization focused on? And this is aligned with the goals of the business. Chargeback for the sake of chargeback isn't really necessary for every organization. So just making sure it's there's a means to an end there. So with that, I'd love to open it up to any questions on these pieces of advice, and we'll leave a bit of free time after this for anybody who wants to see a bit of our platform, for Callum to kind of go through a 5 to 10 minute demo. But any questions from the audience?
There is one question, Will. What do you feel the most difficult part of implementing a chargeback program would be?
I'll give a business take, and Callum, I'll let you do the technical take. So we can both kind of answer this. I think I know we've talked about it a lot, but communicating clearly and enabling your organization prior to launch is very important. And I realize that most FinOps leaders, and really most IT leaders in general, are straddling so many different priorities and focuses, and there's kind of the daily operations minutia that kind of gets in the way. But taking the time to ensure that your leadership and all of the owners of cost are really aligned to what you're doing and how you're doing it is super important. The number one problem that I've seen with chargeback implementation is just not informing your organization before you start, and just the backlash of confusion can really be painful. So over communicate, over enable. I think that's the big one for me. Callum?
Absolutely, completely agree, Will. I think from my perspective, the problem that always comes up is tagging. So it's metadata. It's how are you understanding your cloud environments and the resources you have in your cloud environments, and what logic are you using to initiate chargeback on those environments. So how are you kind of slicing and dicing your data, and are the relevant teams on the same page with that? So kind of, do you have uniform tags, for instance, across all of your production, across all of your development environment? Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest issue. I think inconsistent tagging and inconsistent logic leads to inconsistencies in understanding of how you're billing things, and that's where you get some teams going, oh, why am I being charged X, and why is the next team being charged Y? When you've got a consistent logic for your tagging, then those problems go away.
Yeah, and listen, I mean, I'll tee you up on this one, but constant firefighting of tagging can just cripple a FinOps team, right? So the use of automation and proactive kind of guardrails and policy, that seems to me to be the game changer. And I'm sure you see a lot of that, right, Callum?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the pros of a tool like CloudBolt as well with tagging is that when you do it in the hyperscalers, it's permanent. So like, for instance, in AWS, the tags appear on your cost and usage reports. What you want to do is you're not going to get the right tagging strategy out of the box straight away. Yeah, you're going to chop and change. You're going to want to experiment a little bit. Removing that exercise from your cloud environments is really, really important and really useful, so that you can kind of manipulate the data without actually applying changes to your cloud environments. So there's no risk of kind of you putting having a spelling mistake in a tag, or you saying, oh, actually I've tried workload tag, it didn't really work, I'm going to use project instead, I'm going to use business owner instead, and being able to do that, and not having any risk associated with it. That's, I think, the benefit, because every business is going to have a different strategy, a different logic that they want to apply, and it takes you iterative kind of attempts to kind of get at the kind of the gold standard for that. So yeah, practice makes perfect, really.
I heard a quote at a recent roadshow from FinOps that I really like, which is, hey, there's, I think he said 5 of us on the FinOps team, and there's about 6,000 developers in our company. If we're not using automation, we're fighting a losing battle. So yeah, well said, Callum.
Absolutely. I think once you've identified kind of like for tags in particular, once you've identified, the best strategy for you, you need to use automation to apply it. You can't be going through manually doing it bit by bit. It would be kind of like death by 1,000 cuts.
That's right.
You want to make this whole process as easy as possible. And the reason why it's so difficult in my organization to struggle with it is because it's unintelligible to a lot of people. So really what FinOps is all about is trying to simplify that and make it accessible to your engineering teams and your ops teams and your finance teams. Teams that have technical background and teams that don't have technical background should all be able to come to the same place and understand what's going on, how much it's costing, what's being used.
Exactly right. Well said. All right, I don't see any other questions. So I think we could probably move on to kind of a quick platform demo now. And I will go ahead and hand over the share Callum to you. Can we take 5-10 minutes, just do a quick review. And if anybody wants to have a spin-off demonstration, we can do that.
Sure. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Hi, Sharon. Yeah.
Yep.
Awesome. So this is the CloudBolt main screen for anybody that hasn't seen it. So essentially, these are just a series of widgets that we think are showing information that's relevant to FinOps teams that are interested in your cloud spend. Yeah. So you can see here that we've got, say, AWS cost by day, by month to date, and stuff like that. This is essentially just your cloud environments, how much they're costing. So chargeback, just a little bit of a recap. Then chargeback, what we've said is it's the process of allocating consumption and spend of services from finance systems back to user teams. Well, what that means in a nutshell, essentially, is just kind of giving your teams visibility of what they're using and how much it costs. That is the name of the game. So really trying to make that as easy as possible. So I'll step through a couple of the ways in which we at CloudBolt, how CloudBolt see that issue and some of the things that we think you can do to address it. I think because I've only got 5 or 10 minutes, I'm just going to limit myself to kind of two kind of points. I can go into more detail, as Will said, after this call individually with people if they're interested, and so kind of just reach out to Will or Elaine. We can set something up. But I think the first thing is really it's making sense of your cloud environments. Yeah, making sense of what you've got in your cloud environments. So CloudBolt first off pulls everything in. So what you're seeing right now is, again, aggregate costs. Yeah, it's pulling in all of your billing data. And if you go into the resources tab at the top, you'll see all of your consumption data. So these are all the resources that you have running in your cloud estate at any given time. So here you can see, for instance, some of the compute resources. And say I wanted to go and see how many load balancers I've got in kind of West Virginia. I think we've got some in there. Now you can see you've got the monthly estimated cost there. So CloudBolt's pulling in all of the data, but now we want to make sense of it. How do you make sense of it, really? Well, metadata. Metadata is how you make sense of it. Okay, you're applying logic to the resources that you've already got. Okay, and I think the first level of metadata, the first set of things that you need to apply to your cloud resources are groups, high-level groups. These are business units or applications. Sorry, when the demo environment wants to work. Groups. Groups are your high-level business units, okay? So this could be like your production, development, test, or it could be application 1, application 2, or it could be business unit 1, whatever kind of high-level group you want your business wants to use. That's the first level that you need to decide how you want to kind of split up your cloud estate. So you can see here we've got a number of them set up in our demo environments. I went and set up a test project earlier. So that's the one that I'm going to use in this quick demo. But really, business units, first thing you need to set up. The second thing that you need to think about is resource level tagging. Okay, so these are things like we were talking about earlier. It's workload, okay? It's project, it's owner. These are the things that allow you to identify who's using the resources within a particular department, what they're being used for, okay? And that's going to really enable you to get granular in terms of who's using, how you want to bill it, okay? Who's using it, who owns it, what's it being used for, okay? These are the kind of, and this is almost like a logical exercise that you need to do a little bit ahead of time, yeah? You don't need to get it right first time, but it's something you've got to give a little bit of thought to. And in CloudBolt, you can see here that there are two types of tags. So there's Cumulus or Cumulus and Provider. Cumulus is just the old name for our cost platform, or Cumulus only. And what that basically means is that you can tag within CloudBolt synthetically. So any of the tags that you set up in CloudBolt just exist within CloudBolt. They're not being pushed into your cloud environments. Or you can put them in Cumulus in CloudBolt and in your cloud environments. So say you don't have to do this exercise twice. You want to create your tags in CloudBolt and then you want to set them and you want to push them to your cloud environments. You can do that as well. The tool can do that. But that's
so this kind of allows the correlation between clouds, right? And so that can be very powerful as kind of mapping.
Absolutely.
This cloud has this tag and this cloud has this tag, and they kind of mean the same thing. Or if there's variances in the tagging naming convention or something along those lines, you can reconcile all that right in CloudBolt, right? Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll pull in all of the tags that you've got in your different hyperscaler environments. So if you've got tags in GCP and then different tags in AWS, we'll pull all of that in, and they'll be listed as provider tags. But say you wanted to create a uniform tagging policy. Say CloudBolt, for instance, goes across all the three main hyperscalers. It also goes into your on-premise infrastructure. Say you wanted one tagging policy to rule them all, and you wanted to have the same set of tags and the same set of logic across all of your cloud environments because you're hybrid cloud, for instance. CloudBolt, you're enabled to do that. So you could set that logic once and then push it across all of your environments. And that's the real benefit of, I think, CloudBolt. But essentially, once you've set that, once you've decided what your business units are, the next step is, okay, well, let's get into it. Let's start showing those business units how much they're spending. So you can click into these widgets. It just takes you into the cost reporting feature of the platform. And then all you're doing is applying logic to that metadata that you've set up. Metadata is just the groups, it's just the resource level tagging, and the logic is how you want to filter it essentially. So say I wanted to go, actually, I'll just show you actually down below. I've just clicked on AWS costs by day. This is just showing me how much my entire environment, AWS environment, is costing on a daily basis. Okay. So I want to come in and see how much that test project is costing. So there's the test project group that I set up earlier. Let's filter based on that. And I want to see how much it cost last month. Click apply. And really, there you go. There you can see how much that project is billed aggregately. And then I can also split it out, say, by how many accounts, which accounts this cost is coming from. So you can see here that it's coming from dev, backup, prod. I can also see what services are being called and that I'm using for this project. Okay, and what I'm trying to get at here is that we're trying to enable conversations here between your finance team who are seeing the aggregate cost by day and going, what does all this mean? Okay, and the team that are running the development team, perhaps that are running this test project. Okay, so your finance team can come to your development team and say, hey, look, this is how much your test project is costing. You're consuming all of these resources. And that enables you to have that conversation. Okay, do we need to consume all of these resources? Do we need to have the environments on overnight, for instance, or over the weekend? Is this project a production project, or is it a project that's only run during business hours? You're enabling that kind of conversation, yeah? You're enabling your finance team to say, hey, look, I thought this was um, a data querying project. So I can see that it's got Amazon Athena here, but why are we using DynamoDB? What's going on? And then allowing you to go and say, okay, I see that maybe DynamoDB costs have increased 20% over the last month. What's changed in the project, guys? Yeah. Your engineering teams might have gone, oh, nothing's changed. I'm not sure why those costs have gone up. Thanks for pointing it out. It's enabling that kind of discourse is at the heart of FinOps, I think.
It's also enabling self-service, right? So you can set these groups in logic where, if a user from a certain group logs in, they just see their cost, they just see their contained part of the overall spend, with, again, that layered on, and we can't really get into detail today, but that layered on logic that you can set in the admin side of CloudBolt, so that it is truly showing them what they would be billed at the end of the month, and they can go engage with their cost however they'd like.
Absolutely. I mean, so essentially the nuts and bolts of FinOps are really visualizing cloud spend, and FinOps really is kind of just applying logic to the metadata that you apply to that you attach to your cloud environments. Yeah. And so you can set that logic here in the filters menu here. So I could set up, say, different business units. I can add resource level tags. I can set up date periods. And then you can save the report and send it out to particular teams. You could share this out to, say, your development teams or your production teams, or the teams that are using this particular project, so that they can come in and at a glance see how much they're spending on a particular project, or what services are being called. Or your finance team can go, I'm really interested in this one project on a weekly basis or a monthly basis. I just want to come in and in a couple of clicks see how much it's costing me.
And I see some of the logic underneath, right? So whether we want to show support charges or reservations, all the stuff that we talked about earlier, discount programs, margins, uplift, all that.
Absolutely.
Can quickly be kind of shuttled off to a finance system via API.
Yeah, absolutely. You can also set budgets and stuff for those high-level business units and stuff. And this is, I think, this is kind of like the next level. Yeah. So the first step is kind of allowing your teams to understand the costs that they're incurring, and allowing your finance teams to understand the services that are being called. Kind of that discourse, that kind of conversation between finance and technical is the first kind of level. The second kind of level is, well, let's start adding a level of control to that. Yeah. And that's when you start setting budgets. Okay. So in CloudBolt, we can hook into whatever finance system you've got, whatever your source of truth is in a business, and pull your budgets into it. So say you've got a production budget set in ERP, we can pull that in through an API and set that here. So if your production environments are going to, say you've got a budget of $10,000 or $50,000, if you're actually spending $75,000, you can see when you're going to exceed that budget, and you can see the trajectory of your spend ahead of time. That enables your finance and your engineering teams to have that conversation before budgets are reached. And there's some really, really cool stuff that you can do around machine learning and stuff around budgets that we don't really have time to kind of go into in depth on this call. I see that we've only got a couple of minutes. So if anybody wants to talk through this in more detail, there's some really cool stuff you can do around billing configurations and budgets and machine learning. So please do reach out to Will, and we can get a session in and dive into things in more detail.
Well, Callum, thank you so much. It was great to partner with you on this, and I think that was a very good kind of high-level overview of some of the features that can help with Chargeback. And to everybody that joined, thank you so much for taking the time out of your week. We definitely will be sending out kind of a recap as well as a recording if you wanted to kind of consume this offline, or even share it with your team members. So appreciate it. We'll be in touch. And if anybody wants to talk further, we're happy to do so. So Cal and Elaine, thank you both so much and have a great rest of your week.